The call came in at 2:15 on a Wednesday morning. A resident 3 houses down from the address reported hearing what sounded like a gunshot, followed by shouting. The location was a single-family home in a middle-class neighborhood, the kind of area where people mowed their lawns on Saturdays and knew their neighbors by name. Nothing about it suggested the kind of activity that would involve firearms or late-night disturbances. Deputy Jackson responded with backup already en route. Possible shots fired meant treating the call as high risk. He approached the address with lights off, parking one house away to avoid alerting anyone inside to law enforcement presence. The house appeared dark from the street, but as he moved closer on foot, he could see light leaking around edges of covered windows and hear sounds from inside. Voices, movement, activity that didn't match the 2 in the morning hour. Deputy Martinez arrived and joined Jackson in surveilling the property. They noted several vehicles parked on the street nearby, more than would be typical for a single residence in the middle of the night. The house itself was well maintained, indistinguishable from its neighbors except for the unusual activity level at this hour. Deputy Jackson approached the front door and knocked, identifying himself loudly. The sounds from inside stopped immediately. Complete silence for nearly 30 seconds, then footsteps approaching. A man opened the door just wide enough to speak through, blocking any view of the interior. He claimed to be the homeowner, said there was no problem, and insisted the neighbor must have heard something else. There had been no gunshot, no disturbance. Deputy Jackson explained they needed to verify everyone's safety given the nature of the call. The man was evasive, saying everyone was fine, but not opening the door further. Deputy Martinez noticed the man was sweating, despite the cool night temperature, and his eyes kept darting back into the house as if monitoring something or someone behind him. Then they heard it, a voice from inside, muffled but clearly saying something like help or please. The man at the door tried to cover with a cough and claimed it was just someone watching television. But Deputy Jackson had heard enough. They had probable cause to believe someone inside might be in danger. He informed the man they were entering to conduct a safety check. The man tried to close the door. Deputy Martinez blocked it with his boot. They pushed inside with weapons drawn, immediately encountering a scene that explained everything. The house's interior had been completely converted into an illegal gambling operation. The living room, dining room, and what should have been a family room all contained gaming tables, poker, blackjack, roulette. At least 20 people were present, some at tables with chips and cards, others standing around watching, and several who appeared to be working as dealers or security. But this wasn't just an illegal poker game among friends. The atmosphere was tense, threatening. Several individuals had visible injuries, split lips, black eyes, bruising consistent with recent violence. Some looked exhausted, like they'd been there for hours or days. And most notably, there were armed men positioned around the room, clearly there to maintain control rather than participate in gambling. Deputy Jackson radioed for significant backup and called for a supervisor. This was far more than a noise complaint or even a simple illegal gambling operation. The presence of weapons, the signs of violence, and the way some people in the room looked relieved rather than concerned about police presence all indicated something much darker was happening. As more units arrived and secured the scene, the full scope of the operation became clear. This wasn't a casual underground casino where people came to gamble and went home. This was a debt trap operation that used gambling as a mechanism to capture and exploit victims. The house functioned as a prison disguised as a card game, where people who'd lost money were forced to keep playing or work off debts through methods that constituted forced labor and extortion. Investigators separated everyone present and began conducting interviews. The stories that emerged were remarkably consistent. People had come to the house initially through word of mouth, invited by acquaintances who said there was a private game where the stakes were good and the atmosphere was relaxed. The first few visits often went fine. People won some, lost some, went home. But the operation was designed to identify targets, individuals with access to money but also vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Once a target was identified, the games would be rigged to ensure they lost significant amounts. When they couldn't pay immediately, they were offered credit at exorbitant interest rates, sometimes 300% or more. The debt would balloon rapidly. When targets tried to leave without paying, they were physically prevented. The armed security made it clear that leaving wasn't optional until the debt was satisfied. But satisfying the debt was nearly impossible by design. Victims were forced to keep gambling in hopes of winning back what they owed, but the games continued to be rigged against them. The house always won. Meanwhile, interest accumulated daily. Some victims had been at the house for weeks, trapped in a cycle where they were forced to play constantly with no real chance of clearing their debt. For those who had nothing left to gamble, the operation had other methods of extracting value. Victims were forced to recruit new players, bringing friends or family members to the house with promises of easy money. Each new victim recruited earned credit against the debt. Some were forced to participate in criminal activities, theft, fraud, drug running. The casino operation was actually the front for a broader criminal enterprise that used gambling debts as a recruitment mechanism for forced labor. The violence was systematic and purposeful. Anyone who refused to comply, who tried to leave, or who threatened to report the operation was beaten as an example to others. The gunshot the neighbor had heard was real. One victim who'd tried to escape through a bathroom window had been shot in the leg, the bullet going through without hitting bone, but causing significant injury. He'd been denied medical care and was forced to continue sitting at gambling tables while bleeding through makeshift bandages. The house itself revealed the full infrastructure of the operation. The main floor was the casino area, but the basement had been converted into holding cells where victims who were deemed non-compliant or who needed to be kept isolated were locked up. 3 people were found in the basement, held in rooms with reinforced doors and no windows. One had been there for 11 days, confined to a small space with minimal food and water, as punishment for trying to contact family. Financial records found in a back office showed the operation had been running for nearly 2 years from this location. The house was owned through a shell company that obscured the real owners' identities. Utility bills were paid through accounts that didn't connect obviously to the operation. The entire setup was designed to appear legitimate from the outside while functioning as a criminal enterprise inside. The money involved was staggering. Conservative estimates based on the records suggested the operation had processed over $2 million in the past year alone. Most of that money came from victims who'd been trapped into impossible debt situations. The operators took a percentage of every bet, charged interest on credit extended, and collected fees for everything from food provided to victims, to the use of phones to contact family members who might send money. Investigators found a list of current debtors. 47 individuals owed money to the operation, with debts ranging from $8,000 to over $200,000. The largest debts belonged to people who'd been trapped in the cycle longest. Their original losses multiplied by interest and fees until the amounts bore no resemblance to what they'd actually gambled away. The operators had sophisticated enforcement mechanisms. They maintained detailed files on every debtor, home addresses, family members' information, employment details, anything that could be used as leverage. Threats against family were common. One victim had been told his daughter's school and schedule were being monitored, with the implication that harm would come to her if he didn't comply. Another was told her elderly parents' home would be targeted. The 20 people present at the time of the raid included both operators and victims. Sorting out who was who required careful investigation. Some individuals who appeared to be working as dealers or security were actually victims who'd been forced into those roles as a way to work off debts. Others were legitimate employees of the criminal enterprise, paid to maintain control and ensure the operation ran smoothly. 3 individuals were identified as primary operators. They were arrested immediately on charges including operating an illegal gambling establishment, kidnapping, extortion, and assault with a deadly weapon. The evidence against them was overwhelming. The victims' testimony, the financial records, the physical setup of the house, and their own communications discussing the operation and how to control victims. Medical personnel evaluated everyone present. Multiple individuals required immediate treatment for injuries. The victim who'd been shot, several with untreated wounds from beatings, and one person showing signs of severe dehydration from being confined in the basement with limited water access. Psychological evaluations revealed widespread trauma. People had been subjected to violence, threats, and imprisonment. Many showed symptoms of acute stress and fear. The investigation expanded as detectives traced the operation's connections. This wasn't an isolated criminal enterprise. The operators had ties to organized crime networks that ran similar operations in other cities. The model was consistent. Use gambling as the lure, trap people in debt, extract value through forced labor and criminal recruitment. The house in this suburban neighborhood was one location in a larger network. Federal authorities joined the investigation. The interstate nature of the network and the potential for RICO charges brought FBI resources. Agents began mapping the broader organization, who controlled multiple locations, how money moved through the system, and what other criminal activities the network was involved in beyond illegal gambling. Coordinated raids were executed at 4 other locations across 3 states. 2 were similar house-based casino operations. 1 was a commercial property disguised as a private club. The 4th was a warehouse that served as a counting house for money generated across multiple operations. In total, 63 people were found being held in debt bondage across all locations. The network had been operating for over 5 years. The criminal charges multiplied as prosecutors built cases against everyone involved. The top-level operators faced federal racketeering charges that carried potential life sentences. Mid-level operators who'd run individual locations faced charges of kidnapping, extortion, and operating illegal gambling enterprises. Enforcers who'd carried out violence faced assault charges and weapons violations. The victim advocacy process was complex. Many people who'd been trapped at the house struggled with shame about having been deceived and controlled. They had gone voluntarily initially, believing they were just participating in a private poker game. The transition from voluntary participation to captivity had been gradual enough that some victims questioned their own judgment and blamed themselves for not recognizing the danger sooner. Financial restitution was complicated. The operators had assets that could be seized, but the amounts victims had lost far exceeded what could be recovered. Some people had lost their savings, their homes, or access to retirement accounts. One man had embezzled from his employer trying to satisfy his debt, which led to additional criminal charges against him, even though he'd been acting under duress. The neighborhood where the house was located struggled to process what had happened. Residents had lived next door to a violent criminal operation for 2 years without recognizing it. They'd seen unusual activity but explained it away as perhaps someone who worked odd hours or had frequent guests. The case prompted soul-searching about community awareness and responsibility to investigate suspicious patterns rather than dismiss them. One neighbor came forward with information that, in retrospect, seemed significant. She'd noticed the same cars parked on the street for days at a time, unusual for a residential area where people typically parked in driveways or garages. She'd seen people coming and going at all hours, often looking distressed or injured. She'd heard shouting on multiple occasions. But she'd never called police, assuming it was domestic issues or private matters that weren't her concern. That hesitation was understandable, but ultimately allowed suffering to continue. Law enforcement used the case to encourage community reporting of suspicious activity. Even if something seems like it might be innocent, allowing trained investigators to assess the situation could reveal hidden dangers or ongoing crimes. The house itself was seized as proceeds of criminal activity. The property would eventually be sold, with funds going toward victim restitution and law enforcement resources. But before that could happen, extensive remediation was required. Blood needed to be cleaned from multiple areas. The basement cells needed to be dismantled, and the entire property needed to be. The trial of the primary operators took place 11 months after the initial raid. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, testimony from multiple victims describing the debt trap mechanism and the violence used to enforce it. Financial records showing the systematic exploitation, communications between operators discussing how to maximize profit from trapped victims, and physical evidence from the house. The defense attempted to argue that victims had participated willingly in illegal gambling and were simply refusing to pay legitimate debts. This argument was systematically destroyed during testimony. Victims described being held at gunpoint, being physically prevented from leaving, being denied access to phones or communication with family, being beaten when they tried to escape. The transformation from willing participants in a poker game to captives held against their will was documented through their testimony and supported by physical evidence. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. They found all 3 primary operators guilty on all federal charges. Sentencing followed 6 weeks later. The lead operator received 37 years in federal prison. His associates received 29 and 24 years, respectively. The message was clear. Using gambling as a mechanism to trap and exploit people would result in severe consequences. Lower-level operators and enforcers faced separate trials or took plea agreements. Most received sentences ranging from 6 to 15 years, depending on their roles and level of violence they'd participated in. Several who'd been coerced into working for the operation after being trapped as victims themselves received reduced charges or immunity in exchange for testimony. The broader network dismantling continued for over a year. As investigators traced connections revealed through the initial raids, they identified 32 additional individuals involved in the multi-state operation. Assets worth over $12 million were seized. The organization that had run these operations was essentially destroyed, its leadership imprisoned, and its infrastructure dismantled. For the victims rescued from the house that night, recovery was ongoing. Some managed to rebuild their lives, finding legitimate employment and working to address the financial devastation the operation had caused. Others struggled with long-term psychological effects, difficulty trusting people, anxiety about finances, nightmares about captivity. Several required years of therapy to address trauma. A few victims became advocates for stronger laws against illegal gambling operations and better protections for people trapped in debt bondage. They worked with legislators to pass laws that explicitly criminalized the debt trap model and provided immunity from prosecution for victims who'd been forced to participate in illegal activities while under duress. The case exposed how modern captivity could exist in suburban neighborhoods behind the facade of private entertainment. The house had appeared normal from the outside. Neighbors hadn't recognized that people were being held against their will, just yards from where they slept safely in their own homes. The operation had relied on that invisibility, on the assumption that what happened behind closed doors in a residential area wouldn't draw scrutiny. Deputy Jackson, whose response to the shots fired call had triggered the rescue, reflected on how routine calls could reveal extraordinary crimes. He'd expected to find maybe a domestic dispute, or possibly nothing at all. Instead, he'd discovered a sophisticated criminal operation that had trapped dozens of people and generated millions in illegal revenue. The neighbor who'd called in the original complaint was visited by investigators who thanked him for reporting what he'd heard. If he hadn't called about the gunshot, the victim who'd been shot might have died from infection or blood loss without medical care. If law enforcement hadn't responded that night, people might have remained trapped for weeks or months longer. What had started as a shots-fired call at 2 in the morning had exposed a 2-year operation that had victimized 47 people and generated over $2 million through systematic debt trap mechanisms. The numbers told part of the story. 20 people present at the raid, 3 found locked in basement cells, 63 total victims across the network, 12 million in seized assets, 37 years in prison for the lead operator. But the real measure was in lives saved, in people freed from captivity disguised as gambling debt, and in a community awakened to the reality that modern slavery could exist in ordinary houses on familiar streets. The house was eventually sold to a family who knew its history, but chose to redeem it through occupancy and normal family life. They completely renovated the interior, removing any trace of what had occurred there. Children played in the yard where armed guards had once patrolled. The transformation was physical and symbolic, a house reclaimed from darkness. But for those who'd been held there, the memories remained. The physical space might have changed, but their experiences couldn't be renovated away. They carried what happened in that house with them. A permanent reminder that trust could be weaponized, that entertainment could become prison, and that escape sometimes required luck or intervention rather than just will. The operation was dismantled. The operators were imprisoned. The network was broken. But the echoes persisted in the lives of victims rebuilding after captivity, in families dealing with financial and psychological aftermath, and in a community's understanding that evil operated not just in obvious places, but in ordinary homes where neighbors lived, where no one suspected the horrors concealed behind curtained windows and locked basement doors.